Okay, so in this video, I just want to spend a little bit of time just actually talking through a project scope document, or this would be part of the PID. And of course, as I've been saying through the other videos, the PID is really a collection of the scope and any other supplementary documents that you might have with that. So if you've got a separate business case, or you've got another separate analysis report or something like that, that might go as part of the scope. But for all intent and purposes, for what we want to discuss, let's just put the PID and the scope as one. Let's just say that the scope is going to be 100% of the PID. And because this is the main document, so this is the one I really want to focus on, the one that is the crux of this unit. So the idea is that your sponsor, and in most cases that's your manager or your boss, but it can be in other cases like a key client or someone like that. But just to simplify it, let's just say, imagine your boss has come to you and said, "I've got a job that I want you to manage." So I may not necessarily be a project manager per se. I'm a manager or I'm a leader, but this is really a case where I should manage this as a project, or perhaps one of the other key stakeholders. Maybe I'm managing something that's part of a bigger picture, and that bigger picture is managed as a project. So I'm going to manage my component of that big picture as a project as well. So my sponsor, the boss, comes to me and says, "Tony, we want to change the staff uniform, for example. It could be anything, but let's just say staff uniform for something that's universal. We want to change the staff uniform. I want you to manage this." The first thing that I want to do, I might ask my manager or my boss, say, "Okay, is there a plan? Is there anything ready for me to take?" And they say, "Oh, no, I want you to manage it from woe to go." So basically, they're giving me the concept or the idea, and I have to manage it. So the first thing I want to do is I want to do some planning. And going back to what I said before, prior planning prevents poor performance. We want to make sure that we measure twice and cut once. All those phrases that illustrate the same thing, which is really about the importance of just making sure that we plan. Let's have a look. What's the task that you've given me, boss? Okay, I want you to revamp the staff uniform. So I'm going to sit down and I'm going to put together a scope document. And this scope document is going to set out what I'm going to be responsible for, that is what I'm going to do, and what I'm not going to be responsible for, that is what I'm not going to do. So I've put this example together to illustrate that, and I'll talk through this just to sort of break it down a little bit more. Now, this is for bigger projects. There'll be really lengthy scopes. For smaller projects, you don't want to be spending too much time on it, because the amount of time you invest on your scope versus the project itself won't equate. So what you want to do is it's a sliding scale. How much detail you put in these things depends on the size of the project. But for a project this size, with multiple stakeholders, I'd probably want to take a little bit of time in getting that right. So I won't go through the contents, because we're actually going to go through the contents table, because we'll go through all this. But let's just talk through it. This is just version control. In certain cases, because you're going to go back and forth, do different, you'll do a first draft, you'll get feedback from your project team members, other stakeholders, your sponsor, whoever. You might go back and change bits and pieces, and therefore, it might be a really good idea to keep a version table. So every time it gets updated, you can date when it happened, what's the new version's number, who changed it, who made the changes, and what a description of the changes. So that way you can sort of keep a track of what's been going on with the changes. Okay, so let's start with the actual project itself. This is the crux of it. The first thing we want to be doing as a project manager is really being clear about what's the purpose of this project. So a simple statement, you don't want to get too wordy or too verbose. You just want to get nice and succinct. The purpose of this project is to transition or change a team from the existing uniform arrangements to a new uniform in line with the 2022 rebranding initiative. Now, assuming that this is 2020 that I'm actually saying this, so I imagine that this is a 2-year project. This is a fictitious workplace, by the way. The Domestic Violence Eradication Agency, or DVEA, was established in 2012 to provide a national focus on domestic violence issues. The agency has broad responsibility relating to improve family safety and reducing violence in the home. Responsibilities also include areas of mental health well-being. The agency has 43 staff in total. 2022 sees the 10-year anniversary of the agency, and therefore the executive team has decided to rebrand the agency to reflect a more contemporary look and feel. This will be supported with a 2022 relaunch. As part of the rebranding, the company is looking to revamp, rejuvenate, and revitalize itself. Logos will be revitalized, color schemes will be rejuvenated, and the staff uniforms will be revamped. The staff uniform revamp project will deliver a new staff uniform to all staff as part of the 2022 rebranding initiative. So here, I'm just giving a brief background, and depending on the nature of your work, so your workplace, if it's a private organization, something like Macmillan, like we'd even condense that right down, just get to the crux of it. If you're working within a government agency, a multinational, or something pseudo-government multinational, you'd have to flesh it out because it's going to circulate to more people. So they're going to need to have a pretty clear idea of where this project sits within the general landscape, and hence you're given that background picture. If it's a very intimate project, there's just you, your boss, and a couple of other people who are going to be involved. You may even not even put that in there. But in most cases, it's a really good idea to have the project background in there because, as I've just done with that example, I've actually just illustrated what the background is here. Why are we doing this project? Well, the crux of it is because it's part of a 10-year anniversary, and there's going to be a number of initiatives. And I've identified the whole logo and the rebranding, but then I'm going to narrow down to what I'm in control of, what I'm responsible for, and that's the uniform. So that then allows me to really focus on what my specific part of this project is, which is I'm managing the uniform part. So from there, I'm going to set out some objectives. And the idea of objectives is that they've got to be clear, concise. They've got to be, wherever possible, fact-driven, like number-based if possible. Just some clear goals about what is this project going to be delivering. What's its goals? I'll talk more about deliverables later, but what's its goals? So here, if you can imagine that the boss has just given me this and I'm sitting down with a pen and paper, I'm trying to get clear in my mind, what is it that I'm going to be doing? And this is so I don't run around aimlessly wandering through the forest trying to find my way home. It's actually so that I can set out the path to where my destination is. What does success look like at the end? Well, these are my big three objectives. I'm going to have to design the uniform that gets signed off, and then so I've got some sub. So this is design a uniform that meets this bit here. That's my first objective, and then there's a whole heap of sub elements to that, such as it's got to be in line with legislative requirements. So, for example, work health and safety. It's got to be in line with organizational policy, and that might be around who buys how many pieces and how do they get them cleaned and stuff like that. And it's got to be approved. So I've got to get approval from 80% of the staff. That might be one of the requirements as I'm going back and forth to find out. They say, actually, when you get this uniform, when you choose a uniform, the staff have to be part of that so that they don't feel that you're just lumping it on them. They're actually going to be part of the decision-making process. So we may have like a quantitative figure, 80%, that we've got to achieve before we can do that. So I'm going to put that in there. So that's my first goal, is about getting the design right. And then my second goal or objective is about making sure I get the purchase right, the procurement, getting out there and buying the right stuff within quality, between quality standards, within budgets, and so forth and so forth. So I'll break that down. Demonstrates value for money and is transparent. It's consistent again with policy. Like our business might have procurement policies around buying local first, or and so forth and so forth. So meeting all that. And then the delivery date, it's got to be on site, ready for distribution on this particular date, for example. And then the third objective is about actually issuing the uniforms, giving them to the staff. How are we going to go and give it to them? Do we have to measure them up? What happens if they don't fit? What happens if they're absent? So I'm starting to think about all these things now in terms of my objectives and goals. And then I've got to get all the old uniforms and get rid of them so we don't have any of the old ones floating around. So see now, as a project manager, I'm sitting down, I'm starting to, in my mind's eye, starting to visualize what this project is looking like and what the final goals are going to be. And this is helping me to set up that roadmap that I've been talking about through the other videos. So I'm starting to really set out the path from where I am now to where I need to be. So this is me just writing down the objectives. Now, I've written these down in kind of like halfway private, halfway public, just so that depending on whether you're working for a government agency or a private organization, hopefully it's making a little bit of sense to you. If you're working in a large organization, there'll be templates for this. So if you're working as part of a government organization, they will have a project scope template document that you just fill out and follow the bouncing ball on it. If you're working for a private organization, you might not have one, and you have to get a template or use something like this, and you will change the headings and the components depending on the size of your project and what you intend to do. So that's my first bit, do the project objectives. So now I've got clear in my mind about what my goals are. And this is only my first draft, so I'll come back and forth and so forth, as I was saying earlier. But as my first draft, I've got my objectives down. My next step is now to start to think about that roadmap a little bit more in detail. So I know where I want to go. That's my objectives. I know where I am. That's where I'm currently at. Now I need to just sort of map out, how am I going to get there? And this is really my project approach. What's my approach to doing this? Well, in this case, I'm going to do a 3-stage approach. So when I start to think about this, and I might do some research about if anyone else has done something similar, talk to some suppliers, just have some brief phone calls over with some suppliers, see if they've got any experience with businesses like ours who have done this, or I might talk to some of my colleagues. Once I start to inform myself, I'll start to get a plan of an idea of how I want to approach this project. And I've decided I'm going to do a 3-stage. So my first stage is I'm going to plan the project. I'm going to sit down, I'm going to develop my plans, find out how many people I need for the job, what resources. I'm going to do a risk management plan, and hopefully going to get all that signed off. And then once I get that all signed off, ready to go, then I'm going to execute my plan. So all my plans, and I'm going to get things done. Get the contracts done, get the job orders done. Start receiving the uniforms when they come in, start giving them out. And then my third stage is I'm going to finalize it. And that's where at the end of the project, I'm going to wrap everything up and I'm going to give it back to my sponsor and say, here, all the staff are in the new uniforms, or 80, no, hopefully a bit more, 90% of the staff are in uniform, 10% are absent or on extended leave or whatever, and I'm handing that back to you. Or so you can delegate it to somebody else to do, or whatever the case may be. So in this case, I'm taking a pretty simple approach to my project, which is a 3-stage approach. Stage 1, Stage 2, and Stage 3. And then I'll break each of those down depending on how I see each of those stages panning out. So here at this point, I'm sitting at my desk. I've been up and down talking to people and doing my research and consulting and so forth. And I've got my rough plan of my objectives and my approach to it. Now I want to start thinking about the actual scope. What's in scope? What's out of scope? So this is now where I'm starting to think about, what am I going to be responsible for? I've got a pretty clear idea in my mind about the goals, where I need to go. I've got a pretty clear idea in my mind about the pathway there. That's my approach to it. Now I can start to think about what's within scope and what's outside of scope. So what am I responsible for? What am I not responsible for? Going back to that description I use about, I'm out in the paddock and I've put up the fence where I'm going to dig that hole in the paddock. Everything outside of the fence, you can do whatever you want with it. Everything inside the fence, that's mine. I'm in control of that, and I'm responsible for everything that happens within that. So I need to just scope out this project. So I'm actually going to break it up into the following areas of design, and I'm going to include everything that I feel is my responsibility within design. So consulting with the team, researching vendors, drawing up formal requests for proposals, seeking proposals on uniform design, go through and even to the extent of staff surveys, get their feedback on it, and so forth. That's all within my scope. Also then is the uniform procurement, the actual purchasing of the uniform and getting it. So that's within my scope. So I'll break that down. I'll have to obviously get it signed off. I'll have to involve maybe our legal eagles for writing up the contract and so forth. And then the issuance, so handing out the uniforms, is part of my scope. So I'm actually going to hand out the uniforms. I'm going to then collect the uniforms, which is the next part, and getting all my old uniforms back and destroying them or whatever, donating them for rags and so forth. And then also within my scope is communication, letting all the key stakeholders, well, in this case, I've just identified the staff. Within my scope to communicate with the staff, everything that's going on, getting their feedback and so forth. So here I've identified as much as I can at this point what's in my area of responsibility as a project manager or the person in charge of the project. So then, once I've got an idea of my inclusions, I can start to think about my exclusions. And for this case, I haven't put too many, but you could, depending on the nature of your workplace and how it works, you can list down all the exclusions that's related to the project of what you're not responsible for. So for example, I'm not responsible for replacement of ongoing uniforms post the issuance of these new ones. I'm not responsible for any policies or procedures to do with these new uniforms. That's somebody else's cup of tea to deal with. I'm not responsible for the communication regarding the broader rebranding. So getting back to our customers and our key stakeholders about this rebranding, that's not mine. Or developing the database or record keeping system for the uniform. So keeping a list of who's got what when, that's not mine either. So the inclusions and the exclusions is really critical, because as the project manager, there's a couple of things I don't want. I don't want project creep. And that project creep is when the scope of the project, that fence that I talked about earlier, changes during the project. I don't want that. So I don't want the goalpost to move whilst I'm in the middle of the project, because based on this scope, when I get my sponsor to sign off, this will be the basis for my budget, gets my approval for the money I've got, gets my approval for the time I've got, and gets my approval for the people that I'll be allowed to have. If there's scope creep during the project, that is where it's more stuff gets included into the scope, particularly, then I'll get in strife because I don't have the resources, because my resources have been to the scope that I've identified. So if all of a sudden I've got creep, I'm going to struggle to get on my targets and my objectives. So this document becomes the basis to which I will stand as a project manager and say, this is what was signed off. This is my accountability. I'm happy to do the creep if I am. I'm happy to do those changes to the scope. However, I need you to sign it off, sponsor. So I go back to my manager. This is the project scope management, where I go back to my sponsor and say, okay, you've asked for these changes. Here's the updated scope. Now I want you to sign off on that. And part of that updated scope is an extra 10 grand and an extra 2 weeks and an extra 3 people, 3 FTEs or something like that. So, and if you don't know, FTE, full-time equivalent. So this is really the basis by which, as a project manager, I'm getting really clear. It's a bit like your job description for any other case where, if someone comes to you and asks you to do something that's not in your job description, depending on the circumstance, but you're quite right to be able to say, hey, that's not within my job description and it's not something that I'm accountable for. So the inclusions and exclusions become really critical in terms of, getting that fence that I talk about in my analogy, getting that fence really clear. So now I want to think about assumptions and constraints. Understanding here, I'm still at my desk metaphysically. I'm moving around and consulting and whatnot, but I'm sitting there and I'm going, okay, I know where I need to get to, and I know the pathway, and I know what's included and what's excluded. What are some of the things that I'm assuming are going to happen for this to be successful, and what are some of the possible constraints? So I really want to name any assumptions that are underlying or underlying, I should say, my thinking in terms of this project. So for example, the CEO and the executive team will provide sufficient information and guidance through the consultation to set requirements and parameters for the development of the uniform design. So that's just a wordy way to saying that that the other executives are going to make sure that they keep me informed and they give me their full support. And that might mean things like, making the staff available for consultation, making their staff available for measurements if that's what's required. So I'm assuming that. Right, that just goes, when I was thinking about, I'm gonna measure up the staff, I'm gonna consult with them, underpinning those things that I talked about or I wrote down about, I'm going to be consulting and so forth. There are all these assumptions that their managers are going to make their time available, that their managers are actually say, oh yeah, Tony needs you for this uniform, go and take 10 minutes to go and see him in the designated area. That's an assumption, and if it doesn't happen, that's going to be a major constraint for my project and my planning. So here I want to try and name up as many of the significant ones as possible, so that when I give this to back again, when I go in consultation with my sponsor and inform them about my thinking and share this plan with them and get them to sign it off, they're also seeing what these assumptions are. And if they've got any issues with any of these assumptions, then we can have a conversation around that. So we're not having these conversations midway through the project. So this is identifying some of these assumptions, and this tool's online as well, so you'll be able to look at this in a bit more detail. I'm just trying to keep this as short and succinct as possible so I don't bore you too much. And then again, depending on the project and the nature of the project, you may be also required to do a business case. And a business case within this is again, these aren't hard and fast headings or sections. You may, depending on the nature, it might just be business cost or project cost, or if there's revenue, it might be a revenue component to it. In this case, it's not a revenue. I'm just doing a cost element here. So what I'm trying to do is just identify what I feel are going to be the costs, both the explicit, really obvious costs, and also some of the implied costs that aren't going to be so obvious. So, for example, direct costs such as materials, if I need a consultant, if I need a tailor, the procurement of the uniforms and so forth, they'll be direct costs, really obvious. They'll come through on uniforms and so forth. But there'll be other indirect costs as well. So, for example, my salary, depending on how the cost centers are set up, my salary might have to be accounted as part of this. It's going to be a cost that's going to be incurred by this project. The staff, if we've got 40-something staff, and they're each going to, through the process of this, going to be giving up an hour of their time through the consultation, through the fitting, through the fitting up, through the actual issuement, through the follow-up of handing back their old one. If all that's going to work out to be an hour per person, well, then that's going to be 40-odd hours of productivity that's not going to occur. So I have to count that as a cost as well. Well, I shouldn't say I have to. The business might require me to count that. In other cases, my boss will say, no, that's all right. We're going to absorb those costs. You don't need to put them in there. So here I'm just trying to be as clear as possible on the total cost of the project, because that's what's required for this project. And I can estimate that this project's going to cost about $152,996. And that'll go into the business case for it. Hopefully then my sponsor will then pass that on to the applicable people so that the money's available as the project rolls on. And there's later units about project costs and so forth, but and that's something we'll explore a bit later. But really at this point, we're putting it in our scope, because when their scope gets signed off, behind the scenes, it's our sponsor's responsibility to make sure that money then gets budgeted and is allocated for us, sitting there in our cost center, ready for us to draw upon as we need it as we go through. So now I want to think about deliverables. Deliverables can be tangible or non-tangible, but I want to just let's start off focusing on tangibles, because it's probably the easiest way to think about this in our mind's eye. Deliverables are anything that's going to be produced by the project. So in this case, let's just talk about tangibles. What are some of the tangible physical things that this project will deliver? So I can think about this in terms of reports. So it might be some type of report that says staff have been consulted. These are the numbers of staff who have been consulted, and these are the number of people who have approved the new design. So that's a deliverable, a report that gathers all the data and can be sent up the chain for people to see for approval, so that there's due diligence and governance around the process of what I've done. Can also be things like a contract for our procurement. So when we talk to suppliers and we ask for a request for tender and we get different quotes from different suppliers and we make a decision, we might we'll need to write up a contract of some type. That might be, if that's something that's within our scope, that might be a deliverable. So there's some like supplementary deliverables. The key deliverables are going to be the uniforms, issuing of the uniforms, and the collection of the old uniforms retrieved and destroyed. So we can start to think about what is it specifically that this project is going to deliver in terms of these tangibles. We can also extend that to things that aren't tangible, like non-tangible things, but it gets a little bit more tricky, because you want to try and quantify everything that we do, and that is we want to make it, put a number to it or some type of hard data to it. And when we start getting into intangibles or things that aren't quite as obvious, it makes it a little bit difficult. So as you become more experienced, you'll be able to identify more non-tangible deliverables. But really, to start off with, I just really encourage you to focus on the tangible deliveries. What specifically will we deliver? And if it is, like if one of those deliverables you think of is something like improve morale, right, which is really something non-tangible, I would, if I was working one-on-one with you, I'd say let's try and get this into a tangible. What does improved morale bring the business? And we'd try and identify something like, we might go a decrease in absenteeism. So a tangible for us might be some type of a report that demonstrates a drop in absenteeism over the period of our project, or post our project over a particular period. So I'd always try and encourage as much as possible to stick to tangible. So in this case, as you're working through this unit, can I get you to think about project deliverables and things of physical things that you're going to be delivering as a result of this project? And that can be, as I said, it can be uniforms, but it can be reports. It can be information sessions, emails. It's just anything that is going to be a physical consequence of the project that you're rolling out. So that's your deliverables. And it's really important to know that, because that gets the mind focused in terms of what you're actually going to be producing as you're going through the project. So then I'm into project methodology, and here is I'm really taking those stage approaches that I looked at earlier, and I'm just fleshing this out. And again, depending on the size of your project, depending on the nature of what you're doing, it would depend on how much detail you have here. But really, in this case, because of the size of this project and the context of this project, and it's a fictitious government organisation, so I'm dealing with quite a number of stakeholders and hopefully a very robust governance process. I want to really step through what my approach is going to be, and I'm going to really just articulate and describe this roadmap in significant detail so that I'm clear about how we're going to go about it. I can talk to my key stakeholders, particularly my sponsor, and make sure they're clear about how I'm going to go about it so that there's no surprises for them during the project. And then I can get everybody on the same page. So we've got all expectations. And then when I get my project team, if I'm going to get some people to join my team to assist me with this, I can then sit them down and share this with them, and they're clear about how we're going to go about doing it. So here I've really just stepped it out. Preliminary investigation and research, finalise the budgets, estimates, consult with the CEO and executive team, draw up a request for tender, evaluate the design proposals, and so forth and so forth. Again, just going back to that point, the size of that will depend on the nature of your work and the organisation, whether you're a public company or whether you're a private organisation that you want to be really adaptable and flexible. You might do a little condensed version. There's no hard and fast rule. It would be silly for you to do a really extensive scope or PID if it's just a small minor project. But on the other hand, it'd be really irresponsible of you to do a really small scope and PID, a really short, not well articulated, detailed scope or PID if you're managing a significant project. All right, so 6.2 is the project monitoring. This is really how we're going to keep track. What's my proposal at this stage? Remember, this is still the early planning stage. What's my proposal for keeping track of my project? So really at this stage, I'm going to keep it fairly simple. MS Project, I'm going to use that as my key software, and that's going to develop a schedule out of that, and I'm going to use that as a planning tool, but also as a review tool, which will be my monitoring mechanism. I'm going to have weekly reviews, and that's going to be with the project team, with the key stakeholders, and I'm going to have daily reviews of the project plan, risk management, and so forth and so forth. And I've actually broken that down into different stages. So it's going to be weekly in stage 1, daily in stage 2 and 3, and so forth. And you can expand that on different stakeholders and so forth. So that's really just being clear about how I'm going to keep track of my project, so that as I'm putting my proposal together, my scope, or fleshing out my scope, I'm starting to really think about how I'm going to keep track of it during the project as well. These are all the key significant elements of project management. And here's my milestones. My milestones, as I said in the previous videos for this unit, really just about the different points along the journey that I'm going to tick off as I go along. So I've put significant milestones in there, significant dates, and that's going to shape up my schedule. So really, to do that, I'm starting to do some preliminary planning. There are things like work breakdown structure tools, which I don't want to go too much into this unit because the next unit, the planning unit, the time management unit, I've got quite a significant part of that is on work breakdown structures and scheduling tools and so forth. So I don't want to continually double up. So I haven't talked too much about work breakdown structures here because that's all being held over for the next unit. But you may start to do some preliminary planning with work breakdown structures or schedules to try and get a grip on your milestones and your dates and so forth. In this case, I've broken up the resource requirements. In some cases, for smaller projects, you might put the resource requirements and the costings together because they're hand in glove. But in this case, because of the nature of this project and the context of this project, I've done resource requirements separately. So as I'm starting to think about milestones and planning, I'll be starting to think about resources I require. So as I'm thinking about, we've got to measure up the staff. Well, that means we're going to need an office or some type of secure environment that's going to be private for people. If we think about, we're going to be holding on to the new uniforms for 2 weeks before we issue those, it means we're going to need some storage space. We're going to need to have some storage space as well for the old uniforms when we start collecting those, and so forth and so forth. So I think about resources both in people and in physical resources and start to really think about that. And you'll see from that one there as well, I've also included the money in there because I like to be clear about what the bill's going to be so you don't get any short shrift during the project. And here's my risk management plan. Again, we've got a whole unit on risk management, so I don't want to get bogged down too much in this, but just to sort of start touching on some of the really early ideas about what are things that can go wrong, how likely do we take this to go wrong, and what do we think are the appropriate actions. So we might think about risk management. In this case, because it's a government example, I've gone quite extensively on risk management because that would be a requirement as part of the scope. But for something with some projects within the private sector, especially for smaller projects, you might not need this deep level of detail. You might just have it included in your assumptions and constraints, and then that would feed into your risk management plan when you go into the planning process. But here, with this case, I'm just thinking about the risks. I've given it a reference number, a title, a description of that risk, but then I just sort of think about what are ways that I'm going to deal with that risk. And there are a number of ways that we can deal with risk, such as you can eliminate the risk, or you can have a contingency in place. You can transfer it to somebody else. So, for example, a transfer of a risk might be that if the supply is late, we're going to have a X amount of dollar per day fine. So that way, if we need to go to another supplier, and it's going to cost us more with a short notice, that we're not going to lose out money-wise. So that's really an example of transferring that risk to somebody else. So we think about different treatments, and I'm not going to get too hung up on the risk management element for this unit because we've got a whole unit on that. So I don't want to really get you to get bogged down too much on that because goodness knows we'll spend a fair bit of time on that later. Here now, I'm thinking about my stakeholders. My stakeholders are anybody who's got a finger in the pie. In this example, my CEO, who is a sponsor, the other executives, myself as a project manager, my project team, if I'm going to need a couple of people, the general staff for the agency, vendors and suppliers who are going to supply the uniforms and so forth, any employee representatives. So I might need to take into account like unions or safety reps or any of those as well. I should really think about those people. So here I'm just identifying the different stakeholders and who they are. And then I'm going to think about my reporting strategy. I know who my stakeholders are. How am I going to keep them in the loop? I don't want to get into too much detail here because, again, it's part of the planning process. We're going to do a more extensive comms strategy. But really just in the scope, I'm starting to just put ideas out on paper so I can let the sponsor and key stakeholders know what is going to be my general approach to reporting and communication. So it's going to be, in this case, I'm going to monitor progress using project, and then I'm going to send out those status reports to the sponsor and executive team once a week. I'm going to use Outlook as my main email communication tool. I'm going to have workplace meetings with the staff and the exec just to let everyone know, and I could be more specific about how frequent I want to do that. And I can do presentations for design reviews and so forth. So I'm just really thinking about my comm strategy just broadly and putting that in there. So by doing all that, I'm now in a position where I can present this document to my sponsor. So I should preface that, say, so I've done this my first draft, and I just keep going back and forth consulting with people. I might consult with my sponsor. It's my first draft, boss. This is some of the things I'm thinking. This I'm going through. What do you reckon? Oh, back and forth. When we don't have 200,000, get it back under 150. So so you go back and you start to just tweak things and until you get that informal approval, and that you might be doing that with other executives, or you may be preliminarily talking to suppliers to get an idea about timeframes and what we need to do for getting these uniforms and so forth. And this will, so you, as I said at the start of this, you may have a number of different drafts as you go through this consultation process to try and get it right. Because once your sponsor signs off, well, then that's it. This is going to be the document that's going to be the baseline for your project until such time that we get a review on this scope. And that's where we talk about that scope management, where someone moves a goalpost and then we have to update the scope and then get it all signed off again by our sponsor, so that we don't get dumped with the accountability that we shouldn't be responsible for. So once I'm happy with it, then I present it to my sponsor, in this case, the CEO, and get them to sign off on it. They sign off on it, and then this becomes, as I said, the baseline. As people come onto the project and they want to have an idea about what's going on, I can present this. And then this is the tool that I'll come back to review. Once my sponsor has signed off, then I go back in earnest and start doing the plans. And this is our next unit where I then start to go, okay, we're signed off, we've got the green light, let's get into it. Now, and I should just say, as a caveat to all this is I suppose, the ideal model. Like, the reality in the workplace is that sometimes you don't get the opportunity to scope. Your boss just says, you've got to do this, and this is the time, and this is the money, and no consultation, no ifs, no buts, just execute it. That happens. That's a reality of it. And sometimes on the other end of the scale, you'll be asked to do a scope, and then nothing will ever happen out of it. It just gets pulled out, and that boat has sailed. We're no longer thinking about that, and that's just the nature of the reality of workplaces and working in the project management space. But this is one of the key tools of project management. It's a starting off point. If you're new to project management, it's a lot of information. It's really quite daunting. But like everything else, just take it one step at a time. Look at each of those headings within there. Identify whether with the project that you've got in mind, is it something that would be important to consider? If so, include it in there. Just write a couple of points, go on to the next one. Then you go back and you flesh it out some more, and then you'll think about something. So you'll do one element, and it might be like milestones, and then you'll go through your assumptions and constraints, and you'll identify, oh, I forgot that milestone. You go back and you adjust it and so forth. So my recommendation is that don't start from the first part of the scope and then try and complete it fully complete it before you go on to the next part, because that's not how it works. You'll do a little bit, do some bullet points, just get the main stuff out of your head, go to the next point, and then you'll think about something else you've missed, and you'll just keep going back and forth, and eventually you'll flesh this document out. Before you know it, you'll go, geez, I sat down thinking I had nothing, and now I've got this 10-page document. That's how much I've been able to really flesh this out. And then you'll be confident that you're pretty clear about what's required to do this job. And in some cases, you might go, oh, I don't want to do this anymore because this is unrealistic. Or in some cases, you might go, look, this is really good. And in most cases, I hope you're really keen to do this. All right, hope that's been helpful. As usual, shout out if you have any further questions.